Bore da, everybody. Good morning. I'm Auriol Miller. I'm the Director of the IWA, the Institute of Welsh Affairs. Delighted to see so many of you here today. The IWA is Wales's leading independent think tank, and we have a long track record of shaping debates and influencing change in Wales through policy research and advocacy, our online and print publications, which provide platforms for robust comment and debate, and our agenda-setting events. Welcome to the next in our IWA Rethinking Wales series. We're a membership organisation with members across the country and far further afield. We're funded by our members, the events we run ourselves, and independent trusts and foundations. This is our 6th Rethinking Wales panel discussion, and we're running them on Thursdays at 11 o'clock. Next week, in partnership with the Arts Council for Wales, we'll be focusing on how cultural venues in Wales can survive and thrive. But a few housekeeping issues to go through first, and then we'll get cracking. As you probably noticed, you're going to be muted by the host as participants, and we're going to use a sidebar chat for questions throughout today's conversation. If you want to ask your questions to the panel, can you do so through sending the moderator a question by using the drop-down arrow that says to moderator. Please remember all chat questions are recorded, and we're going to be keeping strictly to an hour, but keeping the chat room open after midday so that you can continue to connect with each other. We're really conscious that people can't meet together in person, and we can use this space to forge new connections. For those of you who haven't joined us before, we started this discussions to shine a light on what matters most to people now in this, our new reality, and to start to look further ahead than the immediate crisis of COVID-19. We're deliberately bringing people together across policy boundaries because we're not yet able to meet in person, like I said. In previous weeks, we've asked panellists and people in the chat room to tell us about their vision of a new way forward for Wales. And this week, we're taking a slightly different approach. This is because last week we saw the publication of the new supplementary budget from the Welsh Government in response to COVID-19. The original budget, published last year, was criticised at the time for not going far enough to meet the goals of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. The supplementary budget has also been published following the Welsh Government's decision to join the Wellbeing Economy Government's WeGo partnership, alongside Scotland, Iceland and New Zealand, nations with a shared ambition to deliver and improve their citizens' well-being through their economic approach. The word unprecedented has been used itself an unprecedented amount of times over the last few months, but a supplementary budget is usually something which brings in a set of relatively minor tweaks. This budget, however, introduces a fiscal response totaling 2.4 billion in new and reallocated funding to support the Welsh economy and public services. So this truly is unprecedented. This additional funding includes obvious areas for emergency funding such as the NHS, as well as direct support to Welsh businesses large and small to help them survive lockdown. And of course, it complements funding from the UK government for similar support like the furlough scheme. So we should, of course, acknowledge the, yes, unprecedented challenge both governments will have faced in devising the packages of support in the face of the pandemic. But ultimately, we are all, as taxpayers, paying for this package of support. And it is right to ask questions. Has the COVID-19 response rewritten the social contract between the public, the state, and the private sector? And if so, what should we, the taxpayer, be expecting in return? Does this supplementary budget deliver on Wales's existing commitments to think and do things differently? Is it really a wellbeing budget? I'm very pleased to introduce today's panellists. We've got Guto Ifan, who's Research Assistant at the Wales Government Centre at Cardiff University. Sophie Howe, the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. Steve Thomas, CBE, retired CEO of the Welsh Local Government Association. Steve is currently the chair of the Merthyr Improvement Board and of Glandwr Cymru, the Canal and Rivers Trust in Wales. And we also have David Evans, the Acting High Commissioner for the New Zealand High Commissioner to the UK. Guto, we'd like to begin with you, please. For anybody who may not have read it, and there may be a few people out there, what are the main headlines from the Welsh Government supplementary budget? How is it different from past budgets? And what does that mean for Wales?
Yeah, so as you said, it's far from the usual technical, quite dry documents that supplementary budgets usually are. As you said, the scale of additional funding being allocated is unprecedented. It's quite remarkable. The budget has grown by more in a matter of 3 months since March than it did in the first 3 years of devolution. under the new Labour government, when public spending was growing quite substantially. So in that, there was £2 billion of consequentials resulting from UK government decisions from the budget and in the COVID-19 response spending. The Welsh Government has also repurposed around £245 million of EU funding, following a decision by the European Commission to allow greater flexibility in how that funding was allowed to be used. There's also around £256 million that the Welsh Government has found within its own budgets to sort of reprioritise to go towards the fiscal response. And in terms of the fiscal response, as you'd imagine, there's a large increase in health and social services spending, so of around £500 million. There's about £200 million for local governments to support their additional costs and their lost income in the first phase of the lockdown period. But by far the largest portion is the £1.7 billion of grants, reliefs and loans to businesses. That amounts to a not insignificant 2.3% of what GDP in Wales was last year. But on top of that, of course, the UK government's fiscal response is having a massive impact on Wales. So our crude estimate of what the UK government's fiscal response this year will be in Wales, so in terms of the furlough schemes, self-employed income support, business loans, welfare measures, etc., that amounts to roughly £3.6 billion. So the fiscal stimulus is pretty huge. But of course, the largest effect on public finances is the automatic drop in tax revenues, which we've already seen in the out-turn figures being published by the ONS. In terms of what's to come for the Welsh budget, there's not included in the supplementary budget, there was a further £400 million of consequentials that have already been announced by the UK government, but not yet confirmed. There's also some unallocated funding within the budget, which can be allocated at future budgets of around £150 million. So the Welsh Government's fiscal response can go much further and can be substantially increased again. And I think there's a discussion about how best to use that additional funding and the balance between supporting households, businesses and public services in Wales. One thing perhaps I should note is that the lack of budgetary flexibilities afforded to the Welsh Government, I think, hampers that discussion and hampers that sort of strategic thinking about how to best to respond to the fiscal or to the economic crisis. The Welsh Government isn't able to fully use the reserves that it's built up. It can't allocate unallocated capital spending to fund day-to-day spending. And of course, the borrowing powers of the Welsh Government are severely restricted. And not only does that draw resources away from the potential a much greater response that we could be seeing, but it means perhaps that the Welsh Government doesn't allocate money at the moment because of the risk of unforeseen demand pressures emerging later in the financial year. And so in that context, there's little surprise that the Welsh Government has broadly followed the fiscal response of the other countries of the UK. I think perhaps to put the budget in a wider context, it does signal the end of a decade-long period of austerity. It is unfortunate that it took a global pandemic for that to happen. Spending for the first time now is set to be above pre-austerity levels on a comparable basis. The crisis, I think, will add additional funding pressures on public services for years in ways that we probably don't fully appreciate yet. The costs of delayed healthcare, for instance, the cost on people's mental and physical health, the cost of school closures on educational outcomes. And I think as we emerge from the crisis, I think we need to learn the mistakes of a decade ago. We're coming up to the 10th anniversary of the emergency budget of June 2010 of George Osborne. And I think that was proved to have put the recovery on hold. It led to the worst decade in terms of economic growth and wage growth for over 2 centuries and left us with very little resilience to the next crisis that we're now in. And I think the recovery period will require a sustained higher levels of public spending and public investment.
Thank you. That's a very good, fantastic summary to set us on the way this morning. Sophie, turning to you, before the budget, you set out a really clear set of calls for what you wanted to see in it. Can you tell us about your hopes ahead of publication and whether you were ultimately pleased with it, and what you think was missing and where it could have gone further?
Well, I mean, the Welsh Government is not just a nice to do wellbeing economics. They, we talk about this kind of concept of wellbeing economics. I suppose the most well understood version of where that's happening is in New Zealand, but actually within Wales, it's not just a policy concept, it is actually a kind of statutory duty through the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So government should be running all of their spending decisions through the lens of how it goes towards meeting the wellbeing objectives that they've set, connected back to our national wellbeing goals. How well have they done that up until now? Well, it's, I suppose, my analysis, which is set out in my Future Generations report, which was published on the 5th of May, is that they are slowly improving in the way that they go about doing that, but have not yet cracked it. What I would say is that whilst New Zealand is probably the best example or the most prominent example of where wellbeing economics is being applied, actually even in New Zealand, that's generally only application in relation to new spending rather than existing budgets. So the task that the Welsh Government has set themselves out in law is absolutely a huge one, and is not something really that any other countries are doing. Back to this budget, you're absolutely right. Before the supplementary budget, I set out 5 areas in which I think the government should be focusing both their spending and their policy decisions in terms of building back better and creating a new normal post COVID. I'm just going to run through those 5, and I'll post a link to the 5-point plan in the chat as well. But an investment in economic stimulus leading to job creation through decarbonisation of homes. So Chris Joffe produced a report earlier in the year, it might be last year actually, it was last year, outlining the requirements around decarbonisation of Welsh homes, some significant challenges there. About 14% of our emissions are coming from energy inefficient homes. And really what the Future Generations Act requires is to identify and do the things that are going to have the biggest benefit to a number of aspects of wellbeing, and if you want to be technical, are going to make the biggest contribution to the Welsh Government's own wellbeing objectives. And to me, retrofitting homes is a no-brainer in that regard. So has the potential to create a significant number of jobs, has the potential to help us meet our carbon reduction targets, and has the potential to put money back into the pockets of the poorest citizens in Wales through reduction of their bills, and to stimulate local economies and so on. Huge amounts of money, however, required to do this. So in the 10-point plan I published a year or so ago, and we were looking at around about £330 million per annum that the Welsh Government, with other sources of investment, would need to put into meeting the scale of the challenge, because the housing stock in Wales is particularly old and particularly challenging to retrofit. But nevertheless, the potential for job creation and economic stimulus is huge. So I understand that there's quite a move amongst the Cabinet for a real focus and investment in this area. The second area is around connectivity. Better ways to connect and move people through digital connectivity, active travel and public transport. We've seen Lee Waters announce £25 million for active travel, and a focus on how public bodies sort of respond to social distancing, pavement widening, so on and so on. That will require some investment, as we've seen, and probably a lot more than £25 million. But I think that area is both a kind of investment response that's needed and a policy response that's needed. So how can we retain the good things that we've seen through COVID in terms of reduced travel, reduced carbon emissions? So if I just point to the M4 decision, for example, in that region, prior to COVID, about 5% of people work from home. Currently, it's 35% of people working from home. Even if we just retain half of that, that would make a substantial impact on a reduction in congestion, probably would make a substantial impact in terms of our reduction in carbon emissions, and would save us the £1.5 billion in capital that was proposed to be spent on widening that road. So we can see there how this is driving, or has the potential to drive, different policy responses. The 3 other areas, invest in skills, and I think what we're seeing through people being furloughed, people losing their jobs, is that there's going to need to be a huge investment package in reskilling people for jobs of the future. And I don't think we've been particularly good at that in Wales at the moment. What we have is a kind of predict and provide model, a short-term predict and provide. Employers say we've got gaps in these industries, regional skills partnerships and the likes fill those gaps. What we should be doing is decide and provide. So we should be deciding what sort of industries we want Wales to be focused on in the future, and those should be linked back to our well-being goals. So low carbon industries, how are we upskilling people in modern methods of housing construction? Who are the renewable energy technicians of the future? So let's not just be filling existing gaps, let's be deciding and providing for the future. And then invest in nature-based solutions. We already have a policy around the creation of a national forest in Wales. Forestry in Wales is one of the, it's still kept going through COVID, not the case in England or Scotland, so we're already ahead of the game in some ways there. What if we went at pace in terms of the planting of our national forest? In Pakistan, for example, the government are taking furloughed construction workers and paying them to plant trees. Are there opportunities around that? Some brilliant local projects out there. Project Skyline, for example, look it up if you haven't seen it. There's some excellent examples of community-based working with nature projects. Further work needed in terms of the job creation potential on that, and we're working with others on that. And then finally, investing in industries and technologies of the future. What the government should be considering is the sorts of businesses that they are bailing out. Are they businesses that are going to take us towards a new low carbon future for Wales, or are they just taking us back? And also the concept of something for something. If government are giving money out, well done to them. They've already said we're not bailing out companies who are based in tax havens, but they also should not be bailing out companies who do not pay their staff fairly, who do not have a carbon reduction plan, and so on. So those are the 5 areas that I think are critical for the government to both invest in and realign policy going forward.
Thanks, Sophie. We'll come back to your take on how the supplementary budget measures up against that when we come to the discussion. I'm going to move on to Steve. So Steve, since you've been retired a year ago or so and freed from the shackles of holding an organisational line, you've been a voice of, if anything, in favour of even more radical changes to Welsh public policy. What was your take on the budget?
I think the obvious answer to the question is it's not a well-being budget. It is, however, I think a seminal emergency budget, as has been stated. I think it's changed the operating models of public bodies overnight. It's shifted the paradigms of service delivery across Wales. Offices have become museums and the local is king. The budget rightly aims to address, I think, the breach in the dam of the Welsh economy and society caused by COVID. But we all know that intense pressures from the economic tsunami approaching, the fragile dam walls is about to spill all over us. I think if one thing the COVID debacle shows us is wasting precious time is a form of really lethal inertia. We were all, I think, heartened last week when Mark Drayford garnered praise for his promotion of devolved decision making. It's timely, I think, that because the greatest test of devolution is upon us. On the same day, an even more important but less noticed statement followed from Rebecca Evans, our finance minister, and she simply stated, and I'll read it: all the evidence and all the advice and expert opinion says we are in for a really, really, really rough time in the period ahead. I would put it to you that the 3 reallys in that sentence are utterly devastating. Our greatest historian, Gwynalf Williams, saw the path of Welsh history as an endless series of brutal ruptures and fracturing. And I think, again, we're in for another seismic shock. Of course, we should budget for well-being, but we need to do much more. If our starting point is the plan we had before the crisis, it will not be enough. We need to go beyond the spending arms race with England on secondary care, agglomerated growth models based on economic boosterism, spatially uneven economic development, and a hodgepodge of skills training. It's a slow burn response to a crisis that could engulf us. Equally, and I'm sad to say this, the promotion of motor cars, planes, and airport now looks like a legacy strategy. In June this year, 720,000 young people across the UK will leave school. They may about be to restage Alan Beesdale's seminal drama, The Boys from the Black Stuff. This was ultimately a tragic look at the way economics and unemployment affect young people. Their well-being should be our overriding concern if we want to avoid a new generation of Yozza Hughes. The number of people claiming unemployment benefits increased to 2.1 million in April 2020, the highest level since 1996. In Dwyfa Meirionnydd in Snowdonia, it was up by 259%. Let's get our heads around this and let's think about how we respond. I agree with Sophie and other people talking about public works. Ed Miliband, for example, has called for an FDR New Deal style zero carbon army, doing public work such as tree planting, insulating buildings and working on green technologies. In Wales, I have some good friends who are currently working up a proposal for a Welsh citizen service to do the same. Indeed, I think a really brave well-being decision would be to prioritise new jobs for the young over us old baby boomers. Also, let's be clear what we mean when we're talking about a budget for well-being. In economic terms, this is a call to unseat economic growth as the main measure of government success. Conventional wisdom will argue that without a well-functioning growth-based economy, we don't have the resources to spend on well-being. Yet the counterpoint to this comes from economists like Joseph Stiglitz, who argue that regardless how fast GDP growth occurs, an economic system that fails to deliver gains for most of its citizens and which a rising share of the population faces increased insecurity is in a fundamental sense a failed economic system. It's a fundamental challenge to orthodoxy, what you're talking about. The promise of GDP growth has a great future behind it. The concept is shattered. But what does it mean for a devolved government when all the major macroeconomic levers are reserved at Westminster? As a former Perm Secretary of Treasury recently admitted, it's generally understood that the Treasury's main contribution to public spending control is to stop things happening. In well-being terms across Wales, we know that a decade-long austerity lockdown cost lives. Deep public spending cuts rendered frontline services and healthcare so fragile that, let's be honest, they could not even cope with bad weather and seasonal flu, let alone a pandemic. We all knew care homes were a tragedy waiting to happen, and we are all culpable in our failure on social care. I hold my own hand up here. A system fundamentally unreformed, underfunded and undervalued, barely able to see the light in the dark shadows cast by large hospitals. A new national care service, fully funded and delivered locally, is surely an idea whose time has come in terms of the well-being debate. Wales has also claimed to be the model of small, smart country government. We have done some great things like the Future Generations Act, the foundational economy, our record on recycling. But with the constraints in which the devolved settlement work, the most overused phrase in Welsh public policy is, you can't do that because. You can't do that because. If that's the case, let's carry on printing those horrible league tables in the Western Mail from reports like the Centre of Towns. It shows out of the top 20 areas that would be most economically at risk from the COVID-19 pandemic, 12 are in Wales. They are tragically the usual suspects: Ebervale to Prestatyn, Kimmel Bay to Tregear. Alternatively, let's recognise our limitations but work within them. What about an all-Wales pilot of 1,000 people to test universal basic income? Why don't public bodies led by the Welsh Government in concert with trade unions announce a 4-day working week, recognising that the AI revolution and the fourth industrial revolution is upon us? Why don't we develop a Green New Deal for Wales based on the tenet of differential growth that will see some sectors grow rapidly while others recede and close down, with the aim of creating a net zero carbon economy in Wales by 2030. I have to say, if we have declared a climate emergency, I've yet to hear the noise of the environmental sirens blazing. Finally, certainly invite Gordon Brown and Paul Johnson, but ask Kate Rayworth, Rutger Bruman, Marina Mascato, George Monbiot, who lives in Wales, what they think. But most of all, ask the Welsh people. Stop doing stuff to them and do stuff with them. Recognise that we form part of a dysfunctional British state that is hemorrhaging. We need to rediscover our voice, like the Scots in 2008. We need a big national conversation about our nation's well-being and how we best achieve it. Politically, this might be Devo Max, it might be federalism, it might be independence. We are a nation historically of theist non-conformists who have somehow morphed into a nation of the pulled punch and who worry a little bit too much about who we upset. Disaster is often the mother of progress, and what's happening now is going to transform everything, and sadly it will get worse. The brutal realities of this moment demand a great reset, and this needs to be underpinned with 1945 levels of ambition. But let's remember, our parents' world was in ruins. Ours is not yet. As Rutger Berman recently stated, it's time to come out of the closet and don't be ashamed to do good.
Thank you. There's a call to arms if ever I heard one, Steve. David, I'm going to come to you next. Very pleased to welcome you to bring another perspective from a wellbeing nation. And obviously New Zealand's arguably further ahead of Wales on the wellbeing agenda in terms of economics. Can you talk us through the process New Zealand went through to focus its budget on wellbeing economics and what worked? And let us know, in terms of your reflections, if there's anything that you think the government might have done differently there. And then afterwards, I'm going to ask you to reflect a little bit on what you've heard so far and what you think Wales might want to learn from New Zealand.
Ora da, mae'n braf cael bod di mehethiw. Good morning. Kia ora koutou. It's very nice to be here today, and my sincere apologies for my Welsh pronunciation, which really should be better given my own Welsh ancestry. But can I thank you, Auriol and the Institute of Welsh Affairs for the invitation to join this session. I'll give a few thoughts and perspectives from New Zealand on our approach to wellbeing, but we're very interested in this topic. We're very keen to learn from Wales and from others, and so we really welcome being part of the conversation. In terms of New Zealand's approach to wellbeing, New Zealand's Finance Minister Grant Robertson is a big proponent of the wellbeing approach, and in a speech earlier this year he made the point that wellbeing's become a bit of a buzzword. It sort of means different things to different people, but fundamentally for him it's based on the idea that the success of a country is about more than GDP, and that while economic growth is important, it doesn't guarantee improvements to people's lives. So as he put it, if our people are not healthy, well-educated, housed and connected to each other, if our environment is polluted, our rivers too filthy to swim in, and our communities are fragmented with trust in institutions low, then we will not have well-being, even if GDP is growing. So I think that's a pretty good statement of how the New Zealand government views wellbeing. In terms of how we got here, I think it's useful to note that our Treasury, so our Ministry of Finance in New Zealand, has been developing effectively a wellbeing framework for over 10 years now. So under the leadership of Gabs McLuth, who's incidentally now the Governor of the Central Bank in Ireland, and now Caroline McLeish, the Treasury's developed what they call the Living Standards Framework, which in turn borrows very heavily from the OECD Wellbeing Framework, which is known as the Better Life Initiative. And the basic idea of the Living Standards Framework is that in providing advice to ministers, it's important to look beyond the traditional economic measures. So it identifies 12 domains of current wellbeing. So they include things like subjective well-being, health, security, income, cultural identity, and 7 others. And it also sets out 4 capitals that are important to future well-being. So in addition to financial, physical capital, it also looks at natural capital, the environment, human capital, and social capital. So, like in Wales, it very much has an intergenerational focus, looking at both the current and future impacts on wellbeing. It is very much a work in progress still. I think that's very much recognised, but ultimately it's about improving the quality of advice being provided to our ministers. And I think one point that's worth emphasising is that the Living Standards Framework is designed to endure beyond any particular government. It's the property of the New Zealand Treasury. But it was used as the basis for the wellbeing budget. So last year, the New Zealand Coalition Government put forward its first wellbeing budget. And so just to give a bit of background to that, the budget priorities were set very early on in the process and based on a wellbeing analysis which drew from the Treasury's Living Standards framework. So they identified 5 areas that would make the most impact from a wellbeing perspective. So just to give you a sense, they were transitioning to a low emissions economy, a productive nation, lifting Māori and Pacific development, reducing child poverty, and supporting mental wellbeing. And then government departments were asked to prioritise their spending bids according to those priorities. And the bids were assessed against the Living Standards framework's 12 domains and 4 capitals. Another aspect of it was that cross-agency or cross-ministry collaboration was very much encouraged. So unlike previous budgets where you tended to get budget bids by particular ministers or particular ministries, this time there was a strong focus on developing joint initiatives across government agencies. So the process and the budget itself were quite different from what had happened previously. And again, the idea is that by taking, a broader focus, you result in a more holistic way of assessing trade-offs and deciding what to fund. So that was the wellbeing budget. The government's working in a number of other areas to promote a wellbeing approach. So it's also there's also some legislative change and some institutional change. So just briefly, just an example of legislative change in New Zealand is the Child Poverty Reduction Act. So that puts into laws measures and targets for child poverty. It's also involved in resulted in a significant investment in the evidential sort of indicators that you need to measure that by our statistics agency, Statistics New Zealand. So that agency also independently reports on child poverty levels in New Zealand, and it also requires that in government budgets there's a separate chapter which reports on progress on child poverty. So in the 2020 budget, which I'll get onto in a second, there was that chapter in there. And just an example of institutional reform, and this came out of the 2019 wellbeing budget. There was a domestic violence package there that involved 10 different ministers and government agencies proposing a joint venture, which has been established, and that sort of creates a whole of government approach to addressing family and sexual violence. The other thing I just wanted to briefly touch on is in terms of New Zealand's approach to trade policy, we also have a wellbeing lens that we apply to that, and it's called the Trade for All agenda. So it recognises that although trade liberalisation, should work for the benefit of all, it doesn't always do that. So we've been developing an approach to trade policy that tries to harness trade for other objectives like the environment, gender equality, protecting the rights of Indigenous people, regional development, amongst other things. So a major report was produced last year by a group of independent thinkers with very sort of diverse backgrounds and expertise, and the government's currently looking at those recommendations, but we anticipate that an FTA between New Zealand and the UK, which we hope will be launched soon, will be probably the first chance really to apply that trade for all approach in practice. And we are applying it in some other contexts plurilaterally with a group of countries. So we've got an agreement we're negotiating called the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability, or the ACTS, ACCTS. And that will liberalise trade in environmental goods and services, fossil fuel subsidy reform, and also establish some guidelines around eco-labelling. So at the moment, it's just a small group of sort of like-minded countries that are negotiating that, but the idea is that it's open to other countries if they want to join. We encourage them to do so. I think, Auriol, you mentioned also there's the WeGo initiative, the Wellbeing Economy Governments Initiative. So we're working with Wales, Scotland and Iceland are also very active in that forum and sharing experiences, obviously all places committed to the wellbeing approach. And just finally on COVID and budgets, because I know that's sort of the topic today. So, it's not a surprise, COVID-19's turned New Zealand upside down just like it has everywhere. And it's both a health emergency and an economic crisis with massive wellbeing impacts into the future. So we also produced a budget in the middle of May. So part of that, or big part of that, was a new $50 billion, New Zealand $50 billion COVID response fund. So that's equivalent to about 16 or 17% of our GDP. And although the first wave was very much about cushioning the blow of the virus, there was also a recognition that there's opportunities to reset economic growth in a way that contributes to well-being. So for example, there's a trades and apprenticeship training package, over $1 billion, an environment investment package, again, about the same amount of money, and similar amount on a low emissions transition fund. And there's also quite a big, about $20 billion worth of that is set aside for policies still to be developed to ensure that we can sort of respond as we go. And our finance minister, who incidentally is also our sports minister, referred to that as a rolling maul approach to COVID measures, which I thought would be a term well understood in Wales. But the overarching message that our Prime Minister, when she was introducing the budget, was that it remains absolutely committed to wellbeing. And so although the budget process this time wasn't really the same as the one I outlined earlier for the 2019 budget process, which of course that was the plan, to go through a very similar one again, it's still very much been looking through the wellbeing lens. So the Prime Minister said all of the work for the budget's being done through that wellbeing lens. The process started in the 2019 wellbeing budget as non-negotiable. It encapsulates our approach to every decision we make and every action we take, be it on an everyday basis or like this in times of crisis. So yeah, just to conclude, I just emphasise that this is a very long journey that we're on. It feels like we're really just still at the beginning, and there's still a lot that we can all need to learn from each other. But again, thank you for the chance to participate this morning.
Thanks very much indeed, David. I mean, some of the things I'm picking up through that, obviously a clear identification of priorities and that cross-government working in particular, and the process that New Zealand went through there. I have a question I'm going to come back to you on in a minute, which is what sort of involvement from people in New Zealand was there in identifying what those priorities are and were and should be, because that's a strong theme that's coming through the conversations that we're involved in today. What's that public conversation about what we want and where we go and what matters? Sophie, I'm going to come to you first, please. There's a question here from Jennifer Parker, which is, does the scale of the crisis mean that the wellbeing framework needs to be updated and made much more ambitious? Is that a corollary of joining the Wellbeing Economic Alliance? So are we measuring the right things and measuring them as well as we could? Because we know that what we measure is what people perceive as what matters.
Well, I don't think that the framework of the Future Generations Act needs to be amended. What needs to happen is better implementation. And what I have found during my monitoring and assessing is that there are some parts of government and indeed the rest of the public sector who are fully embracing, or at least partially embracing wellbeing economics and making policy on the basis of their wellbeing objectives, and others who are completely not. So if we look at our health service, the performance measures by which they are governed and by which financial allocations are made are not in line with the Future Generations Act at all. They are measuring the satisfaction of your the satisfaction you have with your 10-minute GP appointment, the satisfaction with your outpatient appointment. What we should be measuring is the satisfaction you have with your quality of life, because that actually makes a bigger contribution to your health. So I've always seen this as a long-term mission. Just because we've got legislation, it's an excellent starting point. But just by having a piece of legislation enacted, it's not going to change the habits of very many lifetimes. I think that COVID is, a really significant marker which is likely to progress action in certain areas, and I think that there's a real opportunity there. Steve, for example, mentioned UBI and a 4-day working week. That's one of the recommendations in my Future Generations report. It was seen as completely left of field even 6 months ago, and now it's getting mainstream traction. First Minister said the couple of weeks ago in a session I did with him in Hay that he would be interested in rolling out a pilot like that. So I think that there's a time now for us to be really, really ambitious. But I also want to pick up on this, this idea around how do we involve people, because Steve's point, you know, we're doing to rather than doing with, and there's, you know, a whole range of consequences from that, not least Brexit, you know, what's going on currently in terms of Black Lives Matter and so on. And I think that there's a need for fundamental reform in terms of our system of governance, not just in terms of how do we engage with communities, that's really important, how do we involve communities, but how right through the system do we make sure that policy making is reflective of communities that we're serving, and that we're focusing both on coming up with big ideas, but also critically how we actually implement those big ideas. There's a mass implementation gap here in Wales. We've got some brilliant policy. You know, what I say is that government need to be as progressive in their implementation as they do in coming up with the big ideas. Some of the things that I've suggested, a ministry of possibilities based on a model in the UAE where you bring in the best of the civil service, local government, third sector and citizens to come up with ideas to big problems and big challenges, and then actually are responsible for implementing it. A real life fast track, so we value not just Oxbridge graduates in terms of how we promote them through the civil service, but we actually go out and seek people based on their real life experiences. So why wouldn't we have a care leaver in the social services department determining policy for care leavers? Why would we not have a domestic abuse survivor doing the same? Future generations on our boards, we appoint to our boards on the basis, and our, you know, our public appointments on the basis of, you know, do you have skills in risk and governance and HR and finance and so on. We never ask, do you actually have any understanding of the needs of future generations? Do you have any understanding of, you know, what it's like to be a digital native? Do you have any understanding of climate change or carbon reduction or so on? That needs to be a sort of fundamental part of how we go about our governance. And I think without those things, without having a conscious effort to flood our systems of governance with new ways of doing things and people who've not been there before, there's every chance that we just carry on with the same solutions.
Thanks, Sophie. So some clear challenges there. Steve, I've got a question from Aaron Hill from Community Housing Cymru saying, were any of the panel concerned by the Finance Minister's desire for greater flexibility in converting capital into revenue last week, and the potential for this to divert away from long-term capital investments like decarbonisation and house building, which we know have significant positive wellbeing impacts? So there's some nitty-gritty on that, and Guto, I'm going to come to that for you as well afterwards, please.
It's a tricky one, isn't it? Because the quantum of money is so tight. There's a queue forming. There's a queue forming, and you know, it includes local government, includes the voluntary sector, includes the health service, and all of them in the next period will be looking for revenue. A small authority like Merthyr is losing something like £500,000 a month. I understand that Cardiff is losing £10 million a month in terms of income. So there will be a massive queue in terms of revenue. So I understand why the finance minister would do that. It's always interesting. It's an always interesting idea, turning capital into revenue, but it's never quite that simple. But I think, yeah, there's got to be a reserve held in terms of capital. But I think in terms of the task ahead, I'm not quite certain how the Welsh Government budget is going to cope with it, and hence I think that sort of shout out to the Treasury is going to be key. You know, you could start thinking in Wales, you know, do we start leading as a think? Does Wales itself become a think tank? Do we start saying, you know, we bailed the banks out with quantitative easing in 2008. What about some people's quantitative easing in the next period? So, you know, there's a range of things that we could do as Wales and try and put our mark on the future agenda. But as I say, in the short term, I think the Welsh Government's got an incredibly difficult task, and you know, the constraints that they've got to work in are going to be very difficult to overcome. But that's not to say they shouldn't try.
No. So, Guto, what's your take on the Welsh Government's chances of getting some of these flexibilities relaxed by the Treasury, increased by the Treasury?
I think the the call for the full use of its reserves is probably an achievable win, I guess, in their negotiations with the Treasury. It would seem a ridiculous year, or a very strange year, to sort of limit access to reserves, given all the spending pressures that are sort of building up. In terms of converting revenue spending into capital spending, so it needs to be we need to remember that it is a sort of an accounting sort of construct. This is the split between capital and revenue spending. You arguably revenue spending this year to keep public services viable, to keep to sort of boost households' income, to sort of fight the immediate effects of the crisis that perhaps creates or sustains things for the future. So the distinction between capital and revenue in a time of crisis like this is probably it's probably more difficult to think about it, or to think of them as distinct. There was, even before the crisis, there was a discussion in the Treasury that one way to meet their fiscal targets was to sort of class certain areas of spending, such as education spending, such as teachers spending, as capital spending, so that didn't count as revenue spending, because essentially that sort of spending does create assets for the future for the government. So I think, again, that is probably a good win or an achievable or a sensible win. In terms of I think the big question will be whether the Treasury will allow access to borrowing for the Welsh Government. I think to achieve some of these things, it takes a commitment. Some of the things that we've talked about earlier, in terms of the massive investments into building the sort of economy that we want to see in the future, that takes strategic planning and being able to borrow now against revenue spending in future years. And I think in terms of accountability, that should be something that available, a tool available to the Welsh Government if it deems that investing in those sort of industries now is worth it. I think it should be allowed to. Whether the Treasury will agree to that is another thing. The borrowing limits imposed on the Welsh Government were agreed in 2016, and the world was looking very different back then. The cost of borrowing is lowered again. The state of UK public finances, of course, have utterly changed. So the circumstances have changed, and I think the fiscal framework and the rules governing the Welsh budget should change also.
So there's a level of complication that we have, David, here in Wales that you don't have in the same way in terms of devolution, obviously. And one of the things that we have seen, and I would never describe it as a silver lining, but devolution has cut through, and the understanding of devolution has cut through, because there are no silver linings to this for so many people, that the understanding of devolution has cut through to the public in a way that hasn't previously ever been the case, because it's something that affects all of us now. And not something which is out there and just for policy people. So there's a cultural issue, I think, in the civil service, both in Wales and in Westminster. And could you just talk to us a bit, please, about the culture? This is a question from Ed Evans, the culture of the New Zealand civil service and the Treasury when it comes to wellbeing and basing those sorts of investment decisions on it. And how have you had to work on those culture and behaviours as well? Because something that is cutting through is people's behaviour towards Wales and attitudes as well, and how that plays out in some of the behind the scenes work of the civil service.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, as I mentioned, the Treasury in New Zealand sort of was a pioneer in this area within the New Zealand civil service, and has been for some time. That's obviously a really valuable asset in terms of implementing a wellbeing approach, because like everywhere, they're a very significant agency in New Zealand, and they are sort of at the forefront of it. And that's been really important, I think, and it has flowed through into, for other government agencies, into approaches, for example, to planning. So all government agencies are required to think about wellbeing in terms of their strategic planning documents. And, here the wellbeing approach is sort of broadened out a bit, and but all government agencies are encouraged to take an approach that basically moves beyond narrow measures of success. So they're not just thinking about, you know, their particular objectives, but they're thinking about an issue in a broader context. And that goes back to that sort of cross-agency collaboration, which is another sort of cultural change that's, I think, really important when approaching wellbeing. But to look at intergenerational outcomes, or at least look sort of with a longer term frame. So to look at things in 5 and 10 year time horizons, for example, and taking a whole of government approach. So that's definitely, that approach and culture is filtering through the civil service in New Zealand. And then, of course, we don't have devolution, but you know, we have local governments in New Zealand who are obviously really important players in the implementation, but also, as you mentioned, in priority setting as well, because obviously the solutions have to be tailored to local circumstances. And so that's another aspect in New Zealand, and sort of a dialogue that's going on now between the central government and local government, and how that sort of local governments can best contribute, and what role central government has to play in that.
That's a great segue into my excuse me, my next question, and I'm going to come, Sophie, we haven't got very long. Sophie, first to you and then to Steve, particularly around this issue of national and local government decision-making and collaboration, because the question here from Hugh John, which is, given the diversity of the economy across Wales and the reliance in some areas of Wales, both on the public sector and tourism as main contributors to their GDP, but other areas being much more industrial or reliant on business, to what extent should we be localising budgets as part of that, and control over those budgets as part of an investment? You know, Welsh Government has set up 3 economic regions. We at the IWA think there should be 4 for reasons that we set out previously. What's your take on that?
You come to me first?
Sophie first, please, yeah.
Okay, thanks. I mean, I think at the moment there is, you know, a disconnect between what happens at Welsh Government and, you know, how that's relevant down through to local governments. So one of the challenges I've issued, for example, is the extent to which Welsh Government are taking into account at all what the local wellbeing objectives of any of the public bodies that they're flowing out funding to. One of the other challenges is the fact that before anything gets to, say, local authorities, it probably bypasses about 5 or 6 other governance structures before it gets there, or sometimes it goes to local government and then needs to filter into upwards to those governance structures. So I don't think the solution is creating more governance structures in Wales. I think it's actually stripping them away. At the moment, there is very little clarity between, you know, well, give me any acronym ending with a B, and we've probably got one: an RPB, a PSB, an APB, or a CSP in that case. And you know, points for anyone who can put in the chat where all those Bs are and what they actually do. The fundamental problem is the Welsh Government often comes up with a kind of response of creating another new layer of governance without working with the existing structures that it's got, using those structures and bringing some sense to it. So any flow down of you know, money to a local level, which I would support, would have to be in the context of streamlining those governance arrangements and making it absolutely clear what the responsibilities of a particular structure to spend that money is. And it cannot be done, I think, on the basis of an economic growth board, because actually, you know, we need to be looking at things in a much more holistic way. Personally, I think regional public services boards with some additional expertise on them are the way to go, because they cover the public services and broader sectors which have responsibility for pretty much all of the determinants of wellbeing.
So Steve, if 2 of the main failings of the Welsh Government are initiativitis and implementation, how would you help them on a better path?
I mean, I agree with Sophie's point. I mean, I've always loved driving past the Welsh Academy of Pointless Partnerships in Llandryd, North Wales and Metropolitel. And, you know, you look at the scale of sort of partnership activity out there, and it's mind-boggling. I was interested in terms of the question, in terms of the local mix, because I think what's happened is that there's been a lot of work from local authorities on community support hubs, which in effect have become mini councils, which have been very interesting. It's also been interesting as well in terms of how fleet of foot, you know, local authorities can be. The 2 authorities in Wales who've been best in terms of dishing out business support. On the one hand, the smallest authority in Wales, Merthyr, and on the other hand, the largest geographical area in Wales, Powys, and they're up at 91%, and their performance is really good. So I think that is a bit of a lesson about how you are located in your community. In one sense, I think lots of the discussions we had about structures in Wales are now becoming somewhat redundant because of this. And I said, when I was chief executive of WLGA, I had a car once where I did 200,000 miles in it, traveling up and down Wales. What was I doing? Why didn't I do this sort of thing, And it might have been at the time that the video conferencing wasn't that great, but it does really present a new way of doing business. I mean, I was talking to somebody the other day who said we had, prior to this, we were talking about digital strategy. Now we've implemented it. And I think, that points the way towards a new form of public services and a new form of interface. But I also recognize that some people will be excluded on that basis. And I think we've got to think about how we do that. But I totally agree with Sophie. I mean, declutter your life, it's a great motto, isn't it?
Thank you. I've got one more question. I'm going to come to David with this, please. And it's something that I hope you'll be able to answer. Do you think an FTA between New Zealand and the UK might benefit Wales more than other parts of the UK, particularly because our governments are more in alliance on wellbeing economics? And how do you see that working?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really exciting part of this FTA is that the UK and New Zealand are so like-minded on a lot of issues that we want to be able to sort of push the envelope a bit on some of these areas that you can't always get into in FTAs. And as I mentioned, it sort of aligns very well with the process we've gone through in New Zealand of taking this different approach. So I think we will be looking to this FTA to chapters on issues that are quite pioneering in their approach. So I mentioned the agreement on climate change that we're negotiating. We're also looking at quite innovative sort of digital elements in there as well, perhaps looking at gender and what can be done there. So I do think there's a lot of overlap. And as you've mentioned, I think with Wales, from the discussion this morning, I've taken away that there is a lot of commonality and similarity in these areas and a lot to learn from each other. So I do hope, it's obviously just one part of this, but I do hope it's a very complementary part to the wellbeing work that we're doing together.
Well, thank you very much indeed for joining us, and thank you to all our panellists this morning. We're going to start wrapping up. We're going to leave the chat room open so that those of you who have got a conversation going can continue that for a while. What are we going to do with all of this? We're planning to use these sessions as a starting point to develop longer-term policy ideas for post-COVID-19 Wales. We are interested in topics that you think that we should look at next. Food has obviously been something that's been coming up as well. We've got arts coming up soon and a couple more already in the planning. So if you've got ideas, do please get in touch. Can I just come back round all the panellists very quickly? David, you've already said what you're going to take away from this particular conversation. Guto, how about you?
Yeah, maybe there's an awful lot that we could be doing that we aren't doing at the moment. I think there's a question of whether we'll have enough resources, but I guess we won't know unless we try.
We'll know that you will have the detail on that for all of us, so thank you for that. Steve, you have issued a really strong call to arms on a whole series of things, and I know there's work that you're involved in on that will be talked about more broadly soon. But from this conversation this morning, what's the one thing that you think, oh, that's an interesting point?
I think the key thing is keeping the conversation going, and I think the key thing is being brave about the conversation. I think it's not, as I said before, I think sometimes Wales is the land of the pull punch, and I think we shouldn't be afraid of scrutiny, we shouldn't be afraid of debate, and we shouldn't be afraid to tell things as they are, because if we don't do it now, we're never going to do it.
So the opportunity now, this is clearly a critical juncture. Absolutely. And Wales has if we're recognising it, which I think we are in all sorts of different ways, what does that set us on the path to? Sophie.
I think what I'm taking away is that a number of the recommendations that I've made in the Future Generations report really are gaining traction now. Some of those, you know, what might have been seen as left of field recommendations or things that had little chance of being implemented are now gaining traction and could become a very real possibility. And I think it's building on Steve's point, really, that for us to do some of those things to really implement the legislation that we've got, it does require bravery. I've posted, or Jack, who works with me, has posted in the chat the top 20 recommendations. Please do have a look at that. And really what we want to do is to try and build a movement around that, because I think there needs to be this demand for, you know, to government for a bolder and braver set of actions, and COVID provides a perfect platform for that.
So a call from the people. This is what we want, and this is how we want it. Thank you to all our panellists this morning, Guto, Ifan, Sophie Howe, Steve Thomas and David Evans. If you want to receive early notifications of future IWA events and recordings of all our Rethinking Wales sessions, please do join us as a member on iwa.wales, about us, support us. Next week, in partnership with the Arts Council for Wales, we'll be focusing on how cultural venues can survive and thrive. And finally, while of course you're welcome to leave the discussion straight away, we are leaving our chat function open for 15 minutes to capture any other thoughts and suggestions you may not have had time to share during the discussion. All chat conversations are available as a transcript to the IWA team. Thank you very much indeed, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Goodbye.